Democracy has a long tradition in Western Europe, with shining examples such as the early Netherlands, yes, it's good stuff, the numerous iterations of the French Republic,
Hello, mon chéri.
and of course our dear Great Britain.
Hello, Gov. Fancy a chip?
Yet one would be remiss to forget that some countries joined the party quite a bit later than others. In the case of our friends, the Spanish, democracy didn't conclusively arrive until the late 1970s, and it took quite the effort to get there. But let's start at the beginning. Spain, like its northern neighbor France, had remained a monarchy for most of its existence. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century that Spain had its first run-in with democracy, and it went about as well as it did in France. It didn't last very long, and it was extremely violent.
I have a baguette, and I'm not afraid to use it.
The monarchy would survive another 50 years before falling prey to Spanish Democracy II, Electric Boogaloo, better known as the Second Spanish Republic. This second iteration was a very ambitious project. At a time when democracy was crumbling around Europe, here were a bunch of Spaniards instituting freedom of speech, women's suffrage, and, dare I say it, divorce. We won't be going into too much detail here, for this period of Spanish history deserves a video in its own right. But in a nutshell, there were a lot of people who were very unhappy with the new regime. On the one side, you had radical socialists and anarchists demanding the abolition of money. And on the other, you had staunch conservatives and fascists that really just wanted their church back. The fascists eventually started a civil war, and, spoiler alert, they won, in no small part thanks to Uncle Adolf and company. Now, the leader of this new Spain was Francisco Franco, one of the generals that had initiated the rebellion. His model for Spain was a 1930s classic, a single-party dictatorship, if you don't mind, with a closed economy and a habit of violently suppressing its opposition. You'd imagine such a state would have no place in post-World War II Western Europe, but Franco had incredible foresight, or luck, in picking his sides. He kept Spain neutral during the war and aligned with the US afterwards, on the basis of his fierce hatred for communism. Franco even signed an agreement with America in 1953, allowing Uncle Sam access to air bases, naval stations, and pipelines in exchange for the modest sum of $3 billion. Thank you very much. Thus, despite his questionable methods, Franco's regime had tacit approval from the West. Nevertheless, Franco's powers were far from absolute. He had to contend with the numerous factions that had supported him during the Civil War. Arguably, the most powerful were the monarchists, and, well, Franco knew better than to bite the hand that fed him. So, in 1947, he nominally restored the monarchy. I say nominally because it came with quite a few caveats. For a start, the throne would remain empty as long as Franco lived, and he would have the power to decide who the future monarch would be. By that point, however, the previous king of Spain had already died, while his son and heir had been advocating for a liberal constitutional monarchy since 1945, and thus was considered unsuitable to rule. In the end, Franco and the late king's heir reached an agreement. His young son, Juan Carlos, who was just 9 years old at the time, would be the future king. In exchange, Franco would educate him in the ways of Francoism, and would properly indoctrinate him to take up the reins of dictatorship. Juan Carlos went along with this, not that he really had a choice, and would eventually swear allegiance to Franco's party, the Phalangists. When Franco died in 1975, everyone expected Juan Carlos to carry on his mentor's legacy. And yet, when he assumed Franco's dictatorial powers, he did a complete 180 and began instituting the constitutional monarchy his father had dreamed of. He appointed a liberal prime minister who legalized other political parties and began dismantling the dictatorship's institutions. As it turned out, Juan Carlos had been in contact with none other than Henry Kissinger, the US Secretary of State, with the unmatched talent of sticking his hand in virtually every jar imaginable. Kissinger had assured the young king that as long as the existing US military bases remained intact, the US would support the king's efforts to democratize. This support definitely came in handy, For before long, Juan Carlos had to deal with Francoist terrorists bombing police stations and Basque separatists abducting politicians. In 1981, the Francoists in the military even attempted a coup, bringing 2,000 soldiers and 50 tanks onto the streets of Madrid and Valencia. But, luckily, they had no support in the rest of the country, and so it all fizzled out. In the end, Juan Carlos succeeded in bringing democracy to Spain, even though he very well could have retained absolute power. Good on you, Juan. Well, I hope you enjoyed our brief but nuanced retelling of Spain's odd transition to democracy. Unlike Juan Carlos, we here at SideQuest are quite interested in absolute power, so much so that we're accepting any and all support for our cause over on Patreon. Of course, you can also support us by simply liking and sharing this video. Trust me when I say every view counts. Anyhow, remember to come back here in a couple of weeks for the next phalangistically autocratic episode of SideQuest. Now,
Where are my nachos? I need it. I need my nachos. Sure no.
I've offended everybody. The entire world speaks Spanish. What have I done?